Hello, welcome everyone to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Will Hopkins. I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. In case you are new to our organization, our mission is to contribute to creating a world in which nuclear disarmament, mutual security, global understanding, international cooperation, and respect for human rights create social, economic, and environmental benefits for all. In the spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to take a moment now to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We'd like to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they've been stewarding throughout the generations. So back in July of 2020, we started our bi-weekly Monday conversation series as a way to stay connected to each other and to continue our public education work. And we've found it effective enough that we're hoping to just keep doing this every other Monday and on off Mondays with our ecosystems of compassion or spirituality of peacemaking series on off Mondays, sometimes mixed in there as well. Very excited tonight, and part of it's a solemn occasion because of the insanity that's going on in Ukraine and between the U.S. and Russia. But we're very glad to have Dr. Joseph Gerson. Joseph was the keynote speaker at the first conference I ever helped organize as director of New Hampshire Peace Action, our March conference. It would have been back in March of 2010, I believe it was. And Joseph is an elder in our peace movement who I think a lot of us look to for his experience, for his knowledge, for his wisdom, but also for his kindness and his stewardship of community. Every time as a staff member of the American Friends Service Committee, Joseph would come to New Hampshire to check in with AFSC, he'd always make a point to come in and check in and see how I was doing at Peace Action. And it wasn't just checking in on how Peace Action was doing. He wanted to make sure I was doing all right, my family was okay. He's known among us all as not only an elder and a leader and someone whose knowledge we all look to and count on in times like these when it's hard to know exactly what's going on around the world, but also as somebody who's a steward of our community. So I'm really grateful to have Joseph to help us demystify what's going on, and that's both China and the new Cold War, but also what's going on in this moment with Ukraine and Russia. For a bit of bio, Joseph's the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. He's the vice president of the International Peace Bureau. He's co-chair of the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy. He works closely with peace organizations and advocates across the Asia-Pacific and Europe. His books include Empire and the Bomb, How the U.S. Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World, and With Hiroshima Eyes, Atomic War, Nuclear Extortion, and Moral Imagination. Today, the dynamics that mirror the Cold War and many of those that triggered World War I could lead to war via accidents and miscalculations. Our policies block cooperation. It's essential to staunching the climate emergency. And the dynamics right now fuel anti-Asian racism in the U.S. We're looking forward to having Joseph review the rise and enforcement of the U.S. Asia-Pacific Empire, the self-defeating drive to manage or contain China's rise, and give some background to the Taiwanese and South China Sea flashpoints, and maybe give us some alternative common security policies, both with reference to the current situation in the Ukraine and also with the Cold War with China. So without any more talking, Joseph, I'm deeply grateful that you're with us tonight, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much for that extremely generous introduction. I have to see if I can live up to it. I also wanted to thank Amy for her role with this. And as we were saying before we started, this brings back memories of my times in New Hampshire over the years. So I really appreciate that. When we first started talking about this was just to be about China, and then the quote unquote Ukraine crisis hit, and so we added a lot of time. And I'm going to try and do double duty here. I'm going to mostly read from something I've pulled together in relationship to the Ukraine crisis, and then do a bit more free form with a few more slides when we come to Asia Pacific. So there'll be a switch there. I thought to start with a quote from Howard Zinn from the height of the Cold War. He said that just to back up and just to say that I also appreciate seeing other friends here, people I've worked with over the years, and just a wave and a shout out. It's really a delight to see you. So Howard said that we can't be free if we don't know our history. If we don't know our history, every time the president comes on the television and says we're in danger from here or there, without knowing our history, we have nothing to judge that against. It means we have no freedom. We just have to take his word, not her yet, word for it. And so, we have things like the invasion of Iraq, the so-called Tonkin Gulf incident, and we're manipulated and carried along by dishonesty. Were I only speaking about the new U.S.-China Cold War, there would be a lot to cover. But with the Ukraine-Europe crisis, I have a lot to cover. But first, I want to put these two sides of the Cold War, these two dimensions, into a perspective that I think will illuminate the larger forces at play. These are not normal times. We're caught in a Thucydides trap, the inevitable tensions between rising and declining powers that have too often led to catastrophic wars. And as before World War I, there are those dangerous tensions, rising and declining powers, but also complex alliance structures, intense nationalisms, territorial disputes, arms races with new technologies, international economic integration and competition, autocracies, and wild card actors. And this applies both as we look to Europe and Russia, and as we look westward to the Asia Pacific. And it is worth noting that in the midst of all this, the Ukraine crisis, on Saturday, when we weren't looking, the White House put out its Indo-Pacific strategy, a 18-page documentation of why we have to dominate Asia Pacific and how they plan to do it. In Europe, we face not one, but three crises. The struggle between Western Russian-oriented Ukrainians and Eastern Ukrainians struggling over Ukraine's identity. We have the Russia-Ukraine crisis with its very deep and complicated historic roots. And we have competing US-Russian efforts to reinforce their power and influence across Europe. NATO, let's see if I can pull this up. Give me a second here, screen share. Pull this up here. Can you see this? Yeah. So NATO, you recall, was created in the words of its first Secretary General to keep Germany down, the Russians out, and the US in.
The slideshow isn't running. It's just it's a preview.
You know what? I'm just going to make it easy here and get out of the screen share because it'll just be going in too many directions. So I apologize for that. I see somebody else's mountains behind him, Tony's. In any event, I need to stress that Biden's foreign policy priority is not Russia and Europe, but containing China and consolidating US Indo-Pacific hegemony for the 21st century. That region being the world's most dynamic, economically dynamic and vital region. Let's skip over that a little bit. It's also important to recognize that a hidden danger in these Cold Wars, and Will was sort of implying it early on. The intense and dangerous competition prevents meaningful and essential cooperation needed to contain and reverse the climate emergency. Common security diplomacy is urgently needed, not only to prevent catastrophic wars, but also to save humankind from the oncoming climate disaster, which has already begun. We turn our attention eastward today. We face what has been described as a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. The Biden administration is again warning that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is imminent. He has dispatched nuclear-capable B-52 bombers to Britain. He has urged all Americans to leave Ukraine. He has encouraged the halting of all commercial air flights in and out of Ukraine. And he's also encouraged the evacuation of all NATO diplomatic staffs from their embassies. We're told that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could come at any time. We're told that by Biden, but also by the media, which has served as a frictionless conveyor belt for President Biden's and Secretary Blinken's urgent warnings. At the same time, we have to hope that Vladimir Putin is honest in saying that he doesn't intend to invade Ukraine. Difficult to trust such a guy. Earlier today, though, and I should say I've been involved, I don't quite know how it happened, but I've ended up in a track 2 series of discussions, which is to say people who are former policymakers, officials in the US, Russian, and European governments, and senior advisors, as well as think tank people. And it's been a lot to learn today. Earlier today, I received from a high-placed Russian interlocutor saying, and I'll quote, "It seems that the US strategy is now of Paul Revere. It's being applied when you shout something and become a hero. It's obviously many people think this is a win-win strategy. If Russia does not invade, then it's due to their shouting. If it does, then all the way they were right. But I think that in actual life, this strategy may backfire. Russia needs just to do nothing to reveal the hollowness of the whole hysteria." He went on to write that in a couple of weeks, most Russian troops will have left Belarusia according to the schedule. On the Russian territory, Russia will continue to move troops as it thinks proper. So what's next? Will it be possible to convince the world about the imminent Russian invasion for months? Soon it should become so ridiculous that any further rescheduling of the invasion will lose any credibility. That said, and not unlike an op-ed written by former US Ambassador Huntsman, former Secretary of Energy Moniz, and former Senator Nunn, there is a chance that an unintended incident or miscalculation could trigger an all-out war that could escalate to a full-blown US-NATO-Russia war, something which must be prevented by urgent and engaged diplomacy. I'm frankly not sure what to think about what my interlocutor wrote, but he also raised the concern about the voluntary battalions in Ukraine, former right-wing militias that were integrated into the Ukrainian army. He says that they could spark a war by invading the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine in their effort to reunify Ukraine. At the same time, in Moscow, 2 members of the European Parliament have introduced legislation to fully annex Donbass into Russia. And as is in the case of the Georgian-Russian war in 2008, it would take months, if not longer, to learn who on a Friday night in some remote region along the Ukraine-Russian border actually fired the shots that triggered a war. Even if war is avoided, increased Russian, NATO, and Ukrainian military deployments will still remain essentially and dangerously in place for months longer, serving as leverage for negotiations over Ukraine's future, its relations to Russia, and for a revised and stable Euro-Atlantic security architecture. And of course, while they remain in place, so too does the danger. Let me review the causes of the current crisis. This has been a totally unnecessary crisis, fueled in large measure by US insistence on maintaining NATO's open door policy, when the reality is that there's no way that France or Germany will agree to Ukraine joining NATO. Resolution of the crisis could have been achieved weeks ago had Biden and Blinken made the obvious face-saving concession, signaling a willingness to accept a moratorium on new NATO memberships, one that could maybe go for 15 years and be extended beyond that. They could have raised the possibility of building on the 2014 Minsk agreements by stating the goal of creating a neutral and federated Ukrainian state. And recognizing the fears that NATO's expansion and conventional and high-tech military superiority have engendered in Moscow, they could have indicated a willingness to revisit the common security commitments of the early 1990s in order to establish an enduring European security framework. Instead, US insistence on maintaining the possibility of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO has exacerbated a multi-dimensional crisis. Of course, Putin and Russia own their own share of the blame for bringing the world to the brink of war with their military mobilization, their threatening military exercises on three sides of Ukraine. Little known to most Americans, the crisis has been years in the making. In a recent interview, former Secretary of Defense Colin Powell's Chief of Staff, Lawrence Wilkerson, described the excitement, even the giddiness, at the highest levels of the Bush 1 administration about the prospect of cooperating with Russia in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. They even considered the possibility of inviting Moscow to join NATO. In 1990, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, its Paris Charter, which was signed by 34 heads of state, including the United States, quote, ushered in an era of unprecedented commitment to domestic individual freedoms, democratic governance, human rights, and transnational cooperation. 7 years later, it was followed by the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which enshrined commitments to pursue equal security and not to seek one nation's security at the expense of another's. And in 1999, the OSCE again committed, quote, not to strengthen their security the nations agreed not to strengthen their security at the expense of security of other states. It is violation of these commitments to create a post-Cold War European security order that lies at the heart of the dangerous crisis. Malcolm X would have said that the chickens have come home to roost. In a webinar last week, Nina Khrushcheva, who teaches at the New School and is the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, she explained that NATO's expansion to Russia's borders, while Moscow was weak, and given the overwhelming military superiority of the West, Putin, in her words, has had enough of being relegated to sitting next to the toilet. And this led him to precipitate the crisis to restore something like the immediate post-Cold War order, to get away from that toilet. And of course, once something has been given up, then those who took it are rather reluctant to give it back. And thus we face the crisis we're in. As I said earlier, there are three interrelated crises, not one. Developing mutually beneficial diplomatic solutions requires disaggregating what is commonly presented as a single crisis. We are unfortunately confronted with at least three, actually four. First, we have the struggle between Galician or Western Ukrainians and Russian-oriented Eastern Ukrainians over Ukraine's identity and future. You're dealing with linguistic differences, religious differences, cultural differences, historical differences, and different economic interests. Second is the crisis in Ukrainian and Russian relations, which has very deep historic roots. And we have the competing ambitions of two empires, both of which are in decline, the United States and Russia, in order to reinforce their power across Europe. And this has been compounded by the failures of the European nations to create an enduring Cold War security order. The fourth relates to the second front of the new Cold War. There are fears in Washington that if Washington doesn't stand by its European commitments, that Japan, India, and other countries will have second thoughts about relying on the United States in the development of their policies and maintaining their alliances with the United States. So going into Ukraine's identity crisis. For those wanting more detail, I'd suggest a really excellent book by Richard Sakwa titled Frontline Ukraine. In short, Kievan Rus and its 988 conversion to Eastern Orthodoxy lie at the foundation of the Russian nation. Russians really across all those 11 time zones think of of Kiev and Kievian Rus as the foundation of their nation, sort of like in a way people here do when they think about the Mayflower. Ukraine became part of the Lithuanian and later Polish empires. And as a consequence, those in the Galatian West are predominantly Catholic, Western oriented, and Ukrainian speakers, while those in the East are primarily Russian Orthodox, Russian oriented, and Russian speakers. In pursuit of creating a warm water port for the Black Sea Fleet, Russia's Catherine the Great annexed Crimea in 1783. So Russia's ties and commitments to that particular portion of Ukraine go back almost as far back as our revolution here. And over the years of her rule, she basically pulled all of Ukraine into Russian control. In the 20th century, millions of Ukrainians died of starvation in the 1930s as a consequence of Stalin's brutal agricultural collectivization. With no love for the Soviets or Russia, anti-Soviet forces in Ukraine allied with Hitler's Nazis and joined in the devastating march to the east. The first major Holocaust massacre of Jews was inflicted at Babi-Yar near Kiev. At war's end, Ukraine was reunified with the Soviet Union, with Khrushchev transferring Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. And here we have a whole other set of complications. With the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine became an independent state and surrendered the arsenal of nuclear weapons that the Soviets had left behind in exchange for a solemn Russian commitment, backed up by the United States and European countries, to honor Ukraine's territorial integrity. So when we look at the combination of Russia seizing Ukraine, seizing Crimea in 2014, and the intervention of its little green men in the Donbass area, we are dealing with a violation of that Bucharest commitment. Because of its historic ties with Russia and the Soviet Union, Eastern Ukraine's economy was deeply integrated with Russia's, while many in the West sought prosperity and ties to the West. In 2013, an application was made for Ukraine to join the European Union. But again, a problem here from the West. When the EU demanded an all or nothing relationship, that ties to Russia would have to be severed, Ukraine's prime minister at the time, Yanukovych, withdrew the application, which in turn precipitated the Maidan crisis, the mass and initially nonviolent demonstrations in the heart of Kiev. Contrary to respecting the norm of respecting national self-determination in other countries, Senator McCain, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, now the woman in charge of U.S.-Russian relations in the National Security Council, and CIA Director Brennan all felt called to join the Maidan revolt. A compromise, moving up the date for elections, was reached, but then it was breached by armed right-wing protesters, not only armed, but armed and shooting, which led Prime Minister Yanukovych to flee the country. Proclamations of an independent Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in eastern Ukraine followed, reinforced by intervention of Moscow's little green and unofficial military forces. Russia, looking to Crimea, reclaimed Crimea and its Black Sea Fleet, and as you all know, a relatively low intensity war has followed. And looking at Russia and Ukraine, as I've said, Kiev has been central to the creation of the Russian nation and Russian consciousness a millennium ago. Eastern Ukraine remained an integral element of Russian and Soviet empires for centuries, while Galicia was ruled by Poland, Lithuania, and Austria from the 13th century to the end of World War I, a long time. So the ties and the aspirations in Western Ukraine are very much for the West. And this history was reinforced by Russia's self-appointed responsibility to defend Europe's Slavs, European Slavs, a powerful current in Russian culture. When I took my first class in Russian history, one of the first things we learned about was Slavophiles, and had to learn about that relationship. Most Russians believe that Crimea and Eastern Ukraine are inherently Russian, and more than a few extend Russian claims as far west as Kiev itself. Most Ukrainians and much of the world don't share this perspective. There's a long history of Ukrainian resistance to Russian dominance and rule. Respect for the Ukrainian territorial integrity promised in 1994 it was an unambiguous pillar in international law, which was violated by the Russians. And just to say that just as Northern armies in the US believed they had the constitutional right to defeat Southern secessionists backed by England in the 1860s, Ukraine's government and many of its people believe they have the right to repress secessionist efforts, and they in turn have been backed by other countries. Then let's look to the United States and NATO with Russia. Since the end of the US-Soviet alliance that defeated Hitler, the US and Russian empires have competed for control and influence over much of Europe. With the division of Europe at Yalta in 1945, and as a result of the US imposed unification of West Germany, Russia transformed Eastern Europe into a harshly ruled set of satellite nations that served as a buffer, a guarantee against future invasions from the West. And we need to bear in mind that deep in Russian consciousness are the fears of invasion from the West, first by Napoleon, then by the Kaiser, then by Hitler, which took tens of millions of lives. A bit of an anecdote here. A couple of years ago, just before the pandemic, I toured a couple of Russian dissidents. They stayed in my home. And on the morning of March the 9th, when they came down for breakfast, they greeted one another with high fives. Because for them, it was the end of the Great Patriotic War, the Russian defeat of the Nazis. So when we hear and think about Russian fears of invasion from the West, we need to understand it's not just Putin's propaganda; it's deeply held in the Russian mind. Coming back to where we are here. Russia had this this buffer until 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, this buffer state, which in part it may want to reconstitute now, is not entirely unlike the Monroe Doctrine, which the United States has said, the whole of the Americas are for us to dominate. No other country should intervene. And we've overthrown governments and gone to war numerous times to maintain it. So while not approving of what Russia is doing, it's just we need to appreciate that great powers do very nasty things, and we need to find ways to struggle for justice within it. For its part, the U.S. launched back in the 1940s the Marshall Plan to ensure political as well as economic stability in Western Europe, and with the creation of NATO, the U.S. based troops across much of Europe and on. In that period, Berlin was the flashpoint of the Cold War, the most dangerous place, really. And now we face both Ukraine and Taiwan as the most critical flashpoints in the 21st century. Skipping over some things here. So just to say that the agreements and commitments made in the early 1990s were shattered by President Clinton and then Bush the Lesser. The German reunification treaty, which had been negotiated on the condition that no NATO forces would move into East Germany. And in the process of those negotiations, commitments were made that NATO itself would not move closer to a centimeter closer to Russia. But the only thing that went into writing was that NATO forces wouldn't move into East Germany. And Russians to this day are more than a little bit upset that Gorbachev didn't get those broader commitments in writing. So maybe jumping on a little bit here. And just to say that it's worth noting that George Kennan, the author of the U.S. Cold War Containment Doctrine, and Fiona Hill, who we know from the Russiagate hearings, each warned that expanding NATO to Russia's border would trigger a new Cold War. And in the decades that followed, the NATO alliance has reached Russia with US and German troops now based and conducting military exercises along Russia's borders. So while not approving what Putin has been doing, I think we need to understand the role of our government in creating this crisis and the need to address those mistakes by our government to come through this. Then to say a little bit about Putin and Russia's response. Putin's identity and Russia's identity and great power status have put Moscow on the defensive. The Paris Charter and the Russia-NATO Founding Act, those guarantees are in shambles. Moscow was embarrassed at having been unable to defend Slavic Serbia when NATO dismembered Yugoslavia. And there is a pro-Western government in Kiev. And NATO signaled a possible future Ukrainian and Georgian membership, while NATO forces conduct their exercises along its border. And US and Russian air and naval forces press against Russia across the Baltic and Black Seas. Having been relegated to that toilet and having rebuilt Russia's military and economic resources, it's no surprise that at a time when Putin feels that his power and Russian power are as big as strong as they're going to be, that he's trying to use this opportunity to transform the security environment. I guess that's one way of saying it. First, he challenged the United States and its declining Middle East hegemony by intervening on behalf of Syria's Assad dictatorship. The Russian Navy and Air Force are engaged in provocative confrontations with Western warships and warplanes over the Baltic and Black Seas. Russia's functional alliance with China has been deepened, and Putin has now challenged the US and NATO, and certainly Ukraine, by surrounding that country with troops that are arguably in a position to conquer all or part of it. Putin and his government have a powerful hand, but not a sure one. And as a number of people I've been working with have argued, Putin may have no intention of invading Ukraine. His military mobilization and implied threats may well be a desperate gambit, while he has some power, to force renewed negotiations over Europe's security order against the Western, that the West has refused to engage in recent years. But as we said in the beginning, accidents and miscalculations happen. A war over Ukraine could have severe consequences for the Russian economy and thus Putin's hold on power. Russia would face debilitating consequences of the drawn-out Ukrainian resistance. I mean, think in terms of Afghanistan and the Russian forces having to withdraw from Afghanistan and its role in helping to bring down the Soviet Union. And it faces the possibility of even further isolation. The Ukraine crisis has already led Finland and Sweden to move much closer to NATO, and 8 new military bases are being built in Norway. I should also mention another nuclear dimension to the crisis. In their op-ed last week, Huntsman, Moniz, and Nunn termed the current confrontation a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis. There is the danger that if one side or a wild card actor pulls too hard on the Gordian knot of war, military doctrines and political pressures could lead to uncontrolled escalation, even if senior leaders don't want to do that. Think here in terms of what happened in 1914 after the Sarajevo gunshots. It's worth noting that in early January, Alexei Gromyko of the Russian Academy of Sciences advised our Peace and Planet Conference that the nuclear danger could, quote, get worse before it may get better. Focusing on Washington's missile defense deployments in the aftermath of the withdrawal from the INF, he said that, quote, in the eyes of Moscow, there is a high probability of a new Euro-missile crisis exploding in 2 to 3 years if Russia's proposals for a moratorium are not responded to in a rational way. Nuclear posturing on all sides, including NATO nuclear sharing, he said, may change for the worse more quickly than if recent Russian proposals on security guarantees handed over to the US and NATO are not taken seriously. Well, friends, that crisis came rather more quickly than 2 to 3 years. There's one other nuclear danger in this crisis. A number of countries and commentators are noting that if Ukraine had not surrendered the nuclear arsenal that the Soviets left behind, the Russians may not have been so quick to threaten Ukraine. And this could lead to reconsideration of nuclear or non-nuclear policies in Japan, in South Korea, in Iran, or other countries. So there's a whole other dimension to this. I want to close this part of my talk by stressing that diplomatic resolution of the current crisis is possible. The roadmap for peaceful resolution and creation of an enduring and just security order includes negotiating the creation of a neutral and federated Ukraine, drawing on the models of Austria, Finland, and Switzerland. That would allow for religious, cultural, linguistic, and some political autonomy, even democracy. In track 2 discussions that I've been involved in, we're told that behind the scenes, there have been discussions about negotiating an updated intermediate nuclear forces agreement, banning intermediate range missiles and all strike weapons from the Atlantic to the Urals, as well as negotiation of a new conventional forces treaty in Europe. It's clear that if such negotiations take place or move forward in terms of extending New START, that it could also include major reductions in nuclear arsenals. So, we can have some hope. I'm not sure how great that there's opportunity in a crisis and that cooler heads will prevail. But at the moment, hands seem to be pulling on both ends of that Gordian knot. So I'm going to switch now. Give me a second here. I want to see if I can properly get to my my slideshow here as I deal with as I go to Asia Pacific. All right, so put this down, put this here. Now, as some of you know, I'm an absolute Luddite, but we're going to see what I can do here. Screen share. Let me screen share. Can we see this? Can we see the slides? Okay, so I'm going to walk through this. I'll walk through this kind of independent of my outline. The Biden administration.
The slides aren't correct. You need to go into show mode and show the presentation.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah, Joseph, if you can go up to
Top left
show.
corner. Click on from beginning.
I don't want to go from the beginning because I want to go from where I am now. Let me see if I can do that.
That should be an option.
From current slide, which would be the second one.
Yeah, okay, we'll do it from current slide. Okay.
There you
Can
go.
see it now? Okay, yeah. Sweet. Going all the way back, we need to remember. It's interesting in the Indo-Pacific strategy that was just released. We have this wonderful history of the benign engagement of the United States with Asia Pacific and China, going back a couple hundred years. It sort of jumps over the conquest of the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii in order to do that, or even our forces going into China at the time of the oh, come on, Joe, the Boxer Rebellion, we got it, age strikes. And a little discussed in the United States, and we can come back to this in Q&A. The Second World War in the Pacific Theater was actually a battle between contending empires, between the United States empire, Japan's desire to take the whole melon and replace the United States empire, and Britain. And in the end, as we know, Japan lost, the British Empire collapsed, and the Pacific Ocean became an American lake. And the U.S. has exercised full hegemony with the exception of China's revolution and Vietnam's resistance ever since. And we have the reality, if you go back to the Obama, actually Bush, Bush won Bush 2. Bush 2 wanted to make reinforcing U.S. hegemony in Asia Pacific its priority. But that plan was interrupted by 9/11. And then you had the curious reality of the United States and China collaborating in anti-terrorist policies. Then you have Clinton administration, and you have the development of the pivot to Asia Pacific. There was the recognition in the article that Hillary Clinton wrote that the Asia Pacific region was economically the most dynamic, could be the engine of the 21st century's economy. The largest numbers, I guess the majority of humanity is in the Asia Pacific region, now added to the Indo-Pacific region. And therefore, the United States had to reinforce its efforts to control Asia Pacific. So we had the pivot with a commitment to deploy 60% of U.S. military forces to the Asia Pacific. There was a recognition that the U.S. could contain terrorist threats, and the Middle East was left increasingly to NATO. 2010, NATO adopted its out-of-area strategy, largely for controlling resources in North Africa and in the Middle East. We had Trump with his total American first unilateralism, thinking that somehow we could do this on our own. And in many ways that backfired. But with Biden, we have this commitment to alliances, the reinforcement of alliances. And then to appreciate the number of things that people don't know, the U.S. formal military occupation of Japan ended in 1952, in signing of a treaty in San Francisco. But at that time, the United States secretly required Japan to sign on to a U.S.-Japan military mutual defense treaty. And that treaty has been sort of the foundation, the central spoke of, or the central hub rather, of U.S. Military domination in Asia Pacific since 1952. And again, we have a belief that we imposed a peace constitution on Japan. The wide belief is, well, Japan doesn't have a military. Nonsense. Japan has long been one of the world's 10 biggest military spenders. It has a navy, which is probably more powerful than China's. And this has been developed with the encouragement of the United States. When I first went to Japan, now almost 40 years ago, I can remember one of the leading figures in the peace movement telling me that, there's a strong pacifist commitment in the Japanese public, and it wasn't going to be easily overturned. But that, like slicing salami, one step at a time, they could get the Japanese to accept it. And so now we have that with the under encouragement from Blinken. Senior Japanese leaders are saying that they would join the United States in a war over Taiwan. So I'm recognizing the time, so I'm going to move quite quickly here. We have the new AUKUS alliance, United States, Britain, and Australia. This is a nuclear alliance. The idea is to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines and the technology to run them. And thus you face the danger of proliferation. And you have leading figures in India, in Japan, and elsewhere, in South Korea, saying, well, if Australia can have it, why not us? So we have this driving. And this is an alliance designed to contain China. I want to go back and just say that the Quad. There was just this meeting of the Quad foreign ministers went on last Friday. And this is basically an effort to build something like a new NATO alliance in the Asia Pacific. Then kind of moving quickly through the crises areas. As I said before, Taiwan is really the most dangerous flashpoint in the world. and the Biden administration has been playing with fire on this. Beginning in 1979, the U.S. committed to a one China policy, recognizing that Taiwan is inherently Chinese. The Chinese view Taiwan as a renegade province. The reality is that Taiwan was first severed from China in 1895 by the Japanese. It was apart from China to 1945 when the Japanese left, and then with the Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek's forces came, and it's been under basically U.S. protectorate since then. The red line is that if the Taiwanese leadership takes irrevocable steps toward becoming an independent country, China will then intervene militarily. And what we've had in the Biden administration is fairly consistent undermining of the one China policy, even though the new Indo-Pacific policy says we're going to respect it. So we invited the quasi-ambassador from Taiwan to the U.S. to go to the inauguration. We've had senior government figures meet with senior government figures in Taiwan. We've had increased arms sales, and legislation I'll mention as I close is looking to encourage further moves toward Taiwanese independence. And you have a complicated situation here where the majority of the government in Taiwan is oriented toward Taiwan, toward independence. And after more than 100 years of separation, and we can go into this a lot deeper later, you have rising generations of Taiwanese thinking of themselves more as Taiwanese than Chinese. The next big area of confrontation is in the South China Sea. You have the Chinese have declared this 9-dot line, basically claiming 80% of the South China Sea. On the one hand, there's tremendous amount of mineral riches there, but more importantly, oil from the Middle East and 40% of the world's trade essentially moves through the Malacca Strait at the south end of Malaysia and then across the South China Sea. So the oil and fossil fuels that fuel the Chinese, South Korean, and Japanese economies has to move across this. So this is really the jugular vein of the global economy in the 21st century. It is the geostrategic center of the struggle for world power. The United States, and you've got competing claimants. So the Chinese have claimed it, but portions also claimed by Vietnam, by the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Malaysia. So you've had armed clashes, and you have massive military buildups. Chinese, U.S. 7th Fleet totally dominates this area to this day, but the Chinese have built some bases on little islets and reefs, and there's a struggle for power. And with the Chinese developing their missile capabilities, they're increasingly in a position to inflict aerial denial and to control it. So this is a very tense area. You've got all kinds of military exercises taking place. This is a photograph that I caught from a seminar at Harvard. So you can easily see that an incident or accident here could spark an escalation to a very dangerous war. The third area of territorial tensions are between Japan and China. There's in the East China Sea, you really can't see it well here, but you can see the picture on the right. There are these uninhabited rocks, right, that lie between China and Japan. And when Japan and China reestablished diplomatic relations, it was agreed that the question of who had territorial control sovereignty over these rocks would be put on the shelf. Some years ago, an extreme right-wing Japanese politician took the question off the shelf he tried to move to buy them. The Japanese government then moved to calm the situation by buying them themselves from the people who claim to own it. And since then, you've had very intense military operations to basically shows of force on each side, which again could all too easily lead to escalation and war. And under Biden, the U.S. is committed to back China, or rather, is committed to back Japan under the Mutual Security Treaty, Article 5, saying that if it comes to blows, the United States will be on Japan's side in a war against China. So I'm going to close here. There's lots of things that can be done, right? I mean, there's all kinds of common security agreements, joint development of resources, negotiating code of conduct for the South China Sea, encouraging Taiwanese, Chinese negotiations to kind of reinforce the status quo. But most urgently, where we can have some impact is with bills being considered in Congress. There are two bills which have now passed. In the Senate, it's the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, and in the House, it's called COMPETE. The COMPETE bill is not quite as bad as what's called USICA, USICA. And so a number of organizations are urging people to be in contact with their members of Congress as these bills go into conference committee. And so what is it that they're encouraging? I mean, some of this legislation is just mind-bogglingly stupid, mind-bogglingly confrontational. Michael Clare, who's read all 2,000 pages of the Innovation and Competition Act, basically says it's the equivalent of NSC 68, which you'll recall was the document that consolidated and articulated the beginning of the Cold War, or the first Cold War. So urging people to press Congress for commitments that reject the competitive zero-sum rivalry framework. For example, it says that countries have to commit to reject aid from China if they want to get aid from the United States. So it puts countries in the global south in terms of having to choose which side they're going to be on. There's all kinds of policies here in terms of surveillance and trying to preserve U.S. total control over technology in ways that will fuel anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism. And I'll just say parenthetically that our Committee for Sane U.S.-China Policy has planned a really quite remarkable webinar on countering anti-Asian racism, which I believe is on February 28th. Yeah, there are all kinds of policies in there that are encouraging greater independence of Taiwan, which will up the level of tensions. Not only does it increase the tensions with China, but this kind of thing encourages independence-oriented people in Taiwan to move more sharply toward pressing for full independence. And that in turn moves us closer to China's red line and disaster. We need policies in it that will promote U.S.-Chinese cooperation, especially around climate change and health issues. And there are numerous elements in there, increase U.S. military spending for the further military containment of China. So I've gone 4 minutes over what we had projected. I had to hit some things densely. I threw a hell of a lot at you, for which I sort of apologize. And let's see where you want to take it.
All right, folks, moving forward. If you would like to ask your questions yourself, you can feel free to put an asterisk in the chat and I will call on you, or you can use the hand raise function on Zoom. I encourage you not to try to raise your hand on the camera because I can't see all of your faces at once. Your other option for asking questions is to just type them in the chat and I'll read them off for Joseph to respond to. And while folks are articulating, I wanted to use my moderator's privilege to ask my first question, Joseph, which is where most of us on this call today are New Hampshire residents. We live in New Hampshire. And Jean Shaheen has a pretty long history as a senator, but she is a senior Democrat on both Senate Foreign Relations and Senate Appropriations, and kind of uniquely positioned to guide U.S. foreign policy. And not that she has listened to folks like Peace Action often. She has shown herself as someone who's willing to listen at times. In reference to Russia and Ukraine, she's really been a leader in the push towards a hardline, more violent response, more sending more troops, more equipment. She's been kind of a leading propagandist for the war route with Russia. How do you recommend we talk to someone like that, who we really think ought to be thinking about this very differently?
I wish I had an easy answer for you. We have, an unfortunate history in this country of many Democratic liberals being Cold Warriors. It's a long history. Maggie Hassan is not, Shaheen is she's not a lot younger than me. So to say that she's set in her ways is definitely a probability. All I can suggest is trying to reach as many opinion makers in the state as you can, who are open to thinking rationally, and then maybe seeing if you can leverage that into conversations with her. But I read some of the earlier notices about Shaheen and Ukraine, and there's ways in which I bleed for my comrades in New Hampshire. I wish I could say more or be more hopeful.
Well, thanks. It's something for us to start with. David, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, Joseph, thank you for this evening. Can you speak about the importance, if it has any, of the court decision, I'm not sure, maritime law court decision that found in favor of the Philippines,
Right.
Relative to what my dear Filipino wife calls the West Philippine Sea?
Yes, absolutely.
And I'm curious if it's germane to this, how your Filipino colleagues like Walden Bello, how they feel about this.
When I have a little bit more time and I'm not rushed for time, I talk about the South China West Philippine Sea, not only Walden but my other Philippine partners and friends do as well. So for the benefit of others on this call, the Philippines took the question of the legality or illegality of China's 9-dash line to the UN Court for Arbitration, and China opposed even a hearing on that, and in the end, the court ruled 100% in Philippines' favor. So what you had was a declaration essentially by the United Nations, saying that what China has done is illegal. And on that basis, the Philippines, Vietnam, and others have been pushing for China to step back. There's another piece I wanted to say. Yeah, some years ago, I organized a conference in American University, and we did it in collaboration with a Chinese, I would call it a GNGO, a government-backed NGO. And in organizing the conference, I wanted to do a workshop on what we call the South China Sea, and the Chinese did not want to do this, and I insisted on doing it. And so their response to that was to send one of their most influential and powerful authorities in international maritime law to the conference. When we had the workshop, We had him as a speaker. We had, I think, Herbert Docena from the Philippines. You may know him. We had No Vin Long from Vietnam, or actually from Maine. And the audience in that workshop was at least 50% Vietnamese exchange students. And in the course of it, the Vietnamese students gave the Chinese speaker a real run for his money. They gave him no quarter. And finally, he had enough. And he said, you know, it doesn't matter what you say. In time, all of your countries are going to be so economically dependent on China that it won't matter, and we'll get what we want. So this is one of the difficulties I've found in some of the work on trying to prevent war and develop common security and sane U.S. policies toward China and the Asia Pacific, is that some of our friends and allies on the left, and I've long thought I was on the left, can't abide any criticism of China. The idea is that the enemy of my enemy must be my friend, or it's some other kind of psychological dimension. So I think this underlines the look, we're dealing with great powers. China had powerful influence in that sea for a very long time, until the Opium War. China was in many ways the leading country in the world, the most advanced country in the world. And so many of China's leaders today are aiming to reestablish that. And as Lenin said, you have to break eggs to make an omelet. So we're in this very tense and dangerous point of competition between great powers. I mean, as I said at the beginning of the talk, we're in this period of tensions between rising and declining powers, and it is most often led to catastrophic war. So as much as I look for full disarmament, complete elimination of nuclear weapons, I also recognize that we have to pursue policies that will bring these powers back from the brink, that can be a win-win situation for everybody involved, not only the great powers, but also people in the smaller and less powerful countries.
Thanks, Joseph. A lot to think about in that response. Michael, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, my question deals with the joint statement that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping issued right after the beginning of the Olympics, and how they're pledging to work together against countries such as the US who don't seem to honor their treaties and things like that. And going on to the role of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Belt and Road Initiative and all the financing that will entail, all the countries that will be needed, they'll need to borrow money from China. How will that undermine the U.S. imperial or the U.S. The dollar-dominated economic system or monetary system in the whole SWIFT network, if they've committed to pulling out of SWIFT and having their own interbank network?
Yeah, so a couple of points here. First of all, just to say that the U.S. violation of treaties, if there are any Native Americans on this call, will understand that breaking treaties is as American as apple pie. And much of the world doesn't like that. At the same time, we do need to recognize that Russia and China, sometimes contrary to their statements, are not as pure as ivory soap. And so we're talking about the South China Sea, or we're talking about the seizure of Crimea, which maybe could have been done otherwise. They've also violated international law and the UN Charter. So my anarchist spirit says we have to be critical of all governments, but our primary focus has to be on ours. The great power competition takes place on many levels. And certainly it's interesting with the Belt and Road Initiative. Walden Bellow, who was mentioned earlier, a really extraordinary scholar and activist, one of the leaders against the Marcos dictatorship and the U.S. military bases. He has described the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is driven more by the Chinese need for markets to deal with its surplus production and thus to preserve social peace in China than anything else. And interestingly, this has parallels to what the United States did in the beginning of the 1870s when we overproduced agricultural products. People with 40 acres and a mule were facing crisis. And then again in the Great Depression of the 1890s when we went pursuing the China market, the holy grail of capitalism. So clearly this is having some impact. China is buying influence in the same way that, say, the United States bought influence with the Marshall Plan, with the World Bank, and so on. So this is an economic competition that's going to go forward. The other piece to look at, and you were referring to it in terms of currency, is clearly both sides are doing what they can to reduce their reliance on the dollar. And to the degree that they're successful, this weakens U.S. economic and global power. Interestingly, Russia and China are in some ways complementary in their economic structures, right? So China has this unbelievably dynamic economy that needs fossil fuels. China doesn't have a lot of fossil fuels. So they've been building pipelines to bring Russian oil and gas to China, and increasingly this is being paid for in Chinese yuan and in euros. So this is a dynamic that's taking place. One of the things I think we need to think about is back in very ancient history, I had to take a course on the rise and fall of civilizations. Actually, the professor who taught it was cited by Bill Clinton when he gave his acceptance speech in 1992. So how quickly empires will decline is unpredictable. I mean, the Soviet Empire collapsed much more quickly than any of us anticipated. But it's clear that with China's rise, with the growing demands for justice and development in the global South, with figures like Macron and Germans after Trump saying that Europe has to depend less on the United States and look more after its own security and economy. The reality is that U.S. power in the world is going to decline. One of the things we know is that the petrodollars from the Arab world and others that flow into the United States, into our banks, they provide an artificial foundation for our economy, which in turn provides jobs, provides mortgages. So we're in a really, I would say, terrible situation with the unrestrained growth of inequality here. And when empires fall, it's usually the poor and those without resources who pay the biggest price. So I think one of the things that our movement needs to be thinking about is how we build the infrastructure and the policies in this country to help us have a softer landing, even if the empire doesn't totally collapse. And this in turn, I think points to the need to integrate the issues that we work on with and to do our best to integrate movement activities. So, I mean, we're carrying a lot. I mean, the reality is that we live in the heart of an empire. We're people of conscience, and that makes huge demands on us. But the we look to people who were in the resistance in Europe. We look to people who've been in the resistance in Latin America. We take strength from African American brothers and sisters who went through much harder times than probably most of us on this call, and their lives and what they did should inspire us to do what we need to do.
Thank you so much, Joseph. So I'm not seeing more questions in the chat or hands raised, but I have lots of questions that I want to ask you. So I'm just going to go ahead until somebody else volunteers themselves forward and ask my questions. So my the folks on this call are a lot of our core activists, people who are knowledgeable, doing a deeper dive into complex messaging, talking about the influence of the petrodollar cycle on this policy. But we also, we're all activists trying to message this to a broader audience and talk about it. And in particular, in reference to China and Ukraine, I'm sorry, Russia and Ukraine. I'm wondering. I think we've been kind of coalescing around this message of you're hearing that Russia is about to invade Ukraine, and what you need to know about that is that is a lie. That Russia is not about to invade Ukraine. Is that dangerous messaging? Is that accurate messaging? Is that the messaging we should have right now?
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far. I think what we can say is that everything we're hearing from thoughtful Russians who are well connected, from many people in Ukraine and across Europe, is that an invasion is not imminent. That said, we can't be sure, and we shouldn't put ourselves in a position where we've made claims that in the end. I mean, if you have that spark that comes from the Russians or from right-wing Ukrainians in Donbass, that's the kind of thing that can spark. And if you look at what happened with the Russian-Georgian war in 2008, I think it was a couple of years before they could definitively determine who it was who initiated it. It actually turned out to be the Georgians. So I think we have to be more nuanced in what we say. I think what we can say is that sending, there's the $500 million weapons sale that's up in Congress. I think we can say that sending more weapons into that situation, especially in a country where extreme right-wing figures have disproportionate power in the government, is not wise. I mean, it's interesting. In the webinar we did with Richard Sakwa, I asked him about right-wing forces in Ukraine. And you can see, you can even read it in the New York Times, where there was an article to the effect that there are many right-wing militias and forces, and they're saying, yeah, we're willing to fight, but we might be fighting against Zelensky. If he makes too many compromises with the Russians, we may be attacking the government. Now, those weapons are flowing in. Do we want to be arming those people? That's a good question. So clearly the weapons sales are an important leverage. And I think the other piece that we have to hit, as difficult as it is in a country where NATO is still thought of as apple pie, right? The expansion of NATO to Russia's borders, given Russian history and Russian sensitivities, was madness. And some of us were saying so at the time. In fact, George Kennan and Fiona Hill were saying so at the time. So we need to educate that. And we need to talk about the need. Yes, Russia should not have precipitated this crisis with threat of war, but here we are in this situation. We need to have those hard negotiations for a common security order in which, as we committed earlier, no country is going to seek to get security at the expense of the other. That's the basis on which the Cold War itself ended, right? The Palmer Commission and then the INF Treaty. And I can tell you that it's been a rare privilege, unexpected privilege for me to be sort of a fly on the wall in this track two conversation. And what you can see is that people who have connections, they're not members of, but they certainly talk with people in the National Security Council, the Russian equivalent, European equivalents of this. They're talking in very real terms about what negotiations for more of a common security order might look like. What are the possibilities for nuclear arms control to relieve fears? And as I think I may have said before, I spent the morning organizing a webinar for March 2nd, between a leading figure in the Russian Academy of Sciences, Daryl Kimball of the Arms Control Association, and Tara Kronberg of CIPRI in Sweden and Finland. So these kinds of discussions, I'm not saying these people are involved in that, but these kinds of discussions are taking place, and of course, we're not being told about it. And hopefully, I guess my hope is that under combined pressures, that war is not the answer on all sides. We can come to a situation where they proceed with negotiations. So again, as I began with that quotation from a fairly high figure in Soviet political culture, they're saying that an invasion is not about to happen. They're using the Paul Revere analogy. We can't be sure, but we have to indicate that it may not be happening, and we shouldn't be precipitating such a war.
All right.
That wasn't the 3-point talking point. I'm sorry, but I think
unfortunately I'll have trouble turning it into a bumper sticker. But it does help us frame and think about how we're going to talk about it.
We can break it down into talking points.
The next question is from Chris Hansen, one of my board members. Chris asks, the role of fossil fuel access and influence of who can produce and sell them is part of both of these crises. Yet their threat to inflaming the climate crisis is never mentioned, and the commitments to save the planet, those commitments are being ignored. It continues while climate change continues to gain on us. How can this existential threat be given its proper attention in these discussions?
I think the only way just to say, to give the devil its due, we do get lip service to this from the U.S. and from the Chinese, not so much from the Russians. And so, if you look at their documents, they'll say nice words about it, but then what follows is something else. I think what we need to be pressing to Shaheen and to Hassan and others is, we've got kids and grandkids. We want them to have a world in which they can live. So it's important for our government to focus on what's really important, existentially important. That's climate change. That's not who controls the Senkaku Dayu Islands. Common security approaches to the South China West Philippine Sea can be negotiated. Focus on that, goddammit, not military buildup. Let's build common security. Let's build trust. There's no trust at the moment. We've got to build trust if we're going to deal with the climate. We have to fight against having a tragic view of our future and insist. That could include sit-ins in congressional offices. There are all kinds of ways to do it.
All right, so we've got another question from Michael, and then I've got one closing question before we close out. So Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so last year's conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan was mostly a robot war or a lot of drones. Is it likely, if a conflict does break out, that in Ukraine and the Donbass region, that it will be a robot or a computerized war more than a human war?
I think it's going to be both, because the question is going to be who controls territory. And while robots and artillery can destroy, they can't occupy. So we're likely to see, were it to happen, a combination of both. And one of the reasons that the Russians may not invade is the anticipation of armed resistance certainly in the from Western oriented Ukrainians, and the Russians are going to have to consider whether they want or can prevent a replay of Russia in Afghanistan. so they can destroy, but can they really control it? And the same thing applies to Taiwan. The reality is that China can destroy Taiwan, but how then to really rule it when there be powerful resistance? Chinese seem to understand that if there's going to be reunification, they have to win Taiwanese hearts and minds, and so there's a kind of strategic patience, but also an impatience with Xi Jinping, wanting to make this part of his legacy, reunification part of his legacy.
All right. So our closing question is this is from Arnie Alpert and Judy Elliott, and the closing question is references our conversation. Our next in the discussion series will be Michael Clare and Denise Duffield, and they're going to be talking about nuclear danger and back from the brink, and the crossroads of climate and the nuclear upgrades, military spending. Should be a really interesting talk. And so what questions should we ask them, and how should we help guide their discussion when they come on?
I work very closely with Michael. He and I co-founded the Committee for Sane U.S.-China Policy. I have to say, his work ethic makes mine look like nothing. And he is so prolific and knowledgeable in so many different realms. I mean, he's really quite an extraordinary person. I think the questions you want to ask are questions that you were hitting me with. What then do we do? How do we build this consciousness? How do we try to change policy? Beyond that, Michael's last book, was Raising All Hell, Raising Hell. The climate crisis, how the military is dealing with it. So he's got that nailed. With the other piece, which is again, part of the tragedy of this whole situation, both in relationship to Russia and China, is as we move into this new Cold War. We're, as I said in the beginning, we're in a new arms races, both nuclear and with other technologies. Just one thing you might ask me to talk about is the relationship between cyber hacking and accessing command and control of nuclear powers command and control systems. Can you hack into and say disarm China's nuclear infrastructure and thereby make it vulnerable for a first strike, which when they fear that might be the case, they'll have to launch them and they'll have to take a preemptive attack, or they'll think that they have to. So going into some of those dimensions on nuclear, this is something that's being talked about between people here in the United States and China.
Well, Joseph, thank you so much. I feel a lot more qualified to go forward and do work on these issues. We've been focused on Middle East policy and nuclear weapons and Pentagon spending for a long time, and I feel a lot more prepared to move forward doing work around Russia and Ukraine and also around China. I'm so grateful for the way you were able to present this information to us in a digestible way, and the wisdom with which you have advised us has always been a real boon to New Hampshire Peace Action and to the New England's whole peace movement, nationally and globally, the peace movement as well. So I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on tonight and for extending and talking a little more. Do you have last thoughts before I jump into what our upcoming program is?
Only to say that I'm sorry that I threw so much at you in a dense kind of way. But I think just important to try to understand these things. I'll be glad to send a slightly corrected version of what I wrote in relationship to the Ukraine crisis to you for distribution to people who participated in this. And I can send links to some of my China-related articles for people who want to look at it in a more leisurely way. And
thank
just
you,
to
because
appreciate, Just
Go
to
ahead.
appreciate your having me, and I wish I could speak more directly to people here who are on the in the webinar, who've been friends and people I've respected for many years, yourself included, obviously.
Thank you, Joseph. I'd had comments in the chat, and so I was going to have to email you tomorrow requesting your notes so that I could send them out to folks. And I appreciate that you were planning on doing that anyway. So as I mentioned, 2 weeks from today, Michael Clare and Denise Duffield talking about nuclear danger and Back from the Brink. 2 weeks after that, March 14th, we will have some folks from Friends Forever talking about their trips to Northern Ireland and how peacemaking got done there. 2 weeks after that, Hassan El Tayab from Friends Committee on National Legislation is going to talk to us about the largest current humanitarian crisis on earth, which is the ongoing starvation, cholera epidemic, and blockade and Saudi-led offensive in Yemen. So stick with us. Come back every other week on Monday night, and we'll see you there. Thank you again, Joseph.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.